Welcome to our third mini lecture, and in this case, in this lecture, we're going to be looking at the third kind of components in terms of our ecological concepts. And this is the one of what we would call ecological services. And when we talk about ecological services, what we mean are the things that we derive from our environment. And this is a way of thinking about the environment in terms of alternatives. In other words, many of the things that human beings do, we sometimes don't realize how valuable the resources and the services that we derive from the environment are. And so oftentimes we think about ecological services in terms of three ways that we derive service or that the environment provides service to human beings. These are provisioning, regulating, and of course cultural. Now provisioning quite simply means things that we derive directly from the environment. And we want to think about this in terms of, for example, food, both food that is gathered and food that is grown. And so provisioning, in other words, the environment provides the soil, the sunlight, and the moisture for us to grow our food. And in many cases, we actually gather food directly from the environment. In the same way, we gather wood products for a whole range of things, building materials, paper products, chemical products derived from them, as well as biopharmaceuticals. Many of the drugs that we take are derived, in fact, directly or indirectly from the environment, especially forested systems. Energy systems, geothermal, hydro, solar, wind, these are all provisioned. These are things that we get from the environment. Now, oftentimes, again, we think about this without it arguably costing us anything. In other words, we don't think, well, wind doesn't cost us anything. But in fact, the alternative to produce energy in a different manner costs us quite a bit. Or the substitutes in terms of plastics or metal products that we have to use in terms of wood are really quite expensive. And so provisioning in terms is what we take physically, the materials. Now, regulating services are those things that modify, moderate, or maintain our environment. So again, if we think about a very simple one would be climate regulation. If you imagine a house, and we all have been in air conditioning, and again, to air condition a house is a form of artificial climate regulation. Well, this can be done in many cases passively. Some houses are constructed so that the passive solar heats the house throughout the year, and if it's oriented correctly, it remains cool in the summer, and that is a form of servicing that costs us nothing in its direct application, but would cost us quite a bit if we had to do it in an alternative way. The same is true in terms of waste decomposition. Chemical decomposition of our waste can be quite expensive, waste treatment. But what we realize is that in many scenarios, composting, as an example, can deal with household waste quite efficiently for virtually no cost, and in fact considerable benefit. So, and of course the great example where ecological services were kind of developed is the idea of pollination. In other words, it is extremely expensive. Imagine having to pollinate an apple tree. That would be an incredibly difficult task, and yet bees do it for free. Now, people do pollinate. We do pollination by hand, and it's laborious and time-consuming and expensive. So these are things that we gain from ecosystems, environmental systems, without actually having to pay for them, and we gain a considerable benefit. Of course, lastly, there is the idea of cultural services. And so cultural services are things that we derive in terms of our social benefit. And so we look at the environment and we appreciate it. And so we have an aesthetic or a beauty aspect of it. We may see spiritual components. Many cultures see very high spiritual components within the environment. We look at it for personal growth and leisure. And so these are things that we derive. Ecological services are benefits we derive in the areas of provisioning, regulation, and culture that we can see as having a rough economic equivalent. All right, again, if we look back at this, we can see something like a mangrove system as quite beautiful and in fact has, again, all the things we've already talked about, but it actually provides considerable ecological servicing. Mangroves exist as one of the major nurseries to most of the fish that we eat, and so they provide a nursery. They provide a basic development of our food resources. The other thing that mangroves do is they serve as a filtration system for much of the human waste that comes downstream into these areas. The other thing, though, that they do that's really quite important is that mangroves, when they exist, act as barriers, natural hurricane and storm surge barriers. And in fact, when we have mangroves, the amount of damage that is done from a hurricane storm surge is significantly reduced. In this figure, what we notice is that when you have mangroves, their root system and in fact their density really protects a lot of that storm surge, as does the barrier coral reefs. When both those are taken away, the storm surge goes significantly further inland, and so for very little cost, really no cost, we get a barrier protection from extremes of climate. Now, when we think about this then, we can imagine that from a provisioning standpoint, mangroves provide food, that is fisheries, shellfish, etc. Regulating services, they absolutely provide water filtration, storm surge protection. They are extremely important in terms of cultural services in many areas because they maintain indigenous practices. Now, we can also talk, and sometimes people talk about a fourth aspect of ecosystem servicing, which is what we call supporting services. And these are services that are given to other aspects of the system. And so, again, this would be the habitat for birds, etc., that we don't perhaps derive direct benefit from, but the ecosystem as a total does. All right, we'll stop there for this one. We'll pick it up in Lecture 4.